Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this. It's the morning of April 15, 2002. An Air China Boeing 767 carrying 166 passengers and crew is descending through dense, rain-filled clouds toward Busan, South Korea. The visibility is absolutely terrible, and lurking right there within those clouds are steep, rocky mountains. In this explainer, we're going to break down the full anatomy of Air China Flight 129. We'll look at the exact step-by-step sequence of technical and human factors that led this massive aircraft to stray way outside its protected airspace, heading blindly toward a mountainside. So, that brings us to the central mystery we're unpacking today. How exactly does a modern airliner crash, literally moments from landing? This wasn't some faulty aging plane on its last legs. Not at all. Flight 129 was a really well-maintained, 17-year-old Boeing 767. The engines were functioning perfectly, the crew was fully rested, and yet what was supposed to be a totally routine 1 hour and 40-minute flight from Beijing ended in absolute disaster. To understand how complex systems fail like this, we really have to look at the human element first.
Chapter 1. The Flight and the Crew.
Now, what's really interesting about these numbers is that on paper, this looks like a highly qualified team, right? Thousands of hours in the air. But general flying experience doesn't always translate into situational readiness. Just look at the contrast between their total flight hours and their actual experience in their current seats. Captain Winlu had over 6,000 hours of flight time, almost entirely on the 767. But he'd only been a captain for 4 months. First Officer Geyer had over 5,000 hours, but he had spent most of his career as a second officer. This was literally only his third flight as a first officer. And Second Officer Ho Xing-ning, who was handling the radio, this was his very first trip to this airport. So you've got a remarkably green crew facing a really challenging approach.
And that destination was Gim Airport in Busan. This place is known for unpredictable winds, thick fog, and some seriously dangerous mountainous terrain to the north. Because of these hazards, South Korea actually classified it as a special airport, which means pilots normally need extra training to fly there. But crucially, Air China hadn't adopted this classification for Gim. Under their rules at the time, any pilot, no matter how unfamiliar they were with the terrain, could fly there. This meant a relatively inexperienced crew was flying practically blind into one of the region's trickiest spots. Moving right along to Chapter 2, a sudden change of plans. So, as the crew approaches South Korea, the weather is just notoriously bad. We're talking rain, thick fog, and a scattered cloud layer starting at a mere 500 feet. And right as they're getting ready to land, air traffic control throws them a massive curveball. Originally, they were fully expecting to land on runway 36 left. That's a straightforward approach using an instrument landing system, or ILS, which practically guides the plane right down to the tarmac using radio signals. Easy, right? Well, due to a sudden, really strong tailwind, the tower tells them to land in the exact opposite direction, on runway 18 right. This runway had zero instrument guidance for the approach. It required a demanding, entirely visual circle-to-land maneuver.
And this brings us to the first fatal error of the flight. The crew had absolutely never performed a circling approach at this specific airport before. Yet, despite the sudden change and the treacherous weather, they skipped a full briefing. They casually mentioned which runway exit to take and noted the 700-foot altitude, and that was kind of it. They didn't review the exact timing, the speeds, or the massive terrain hazards they needed to avoid to survive this maneuver.
Chapter 3. Executing a Circling Approach.
And this brilliantly illustrates what a circling approach actually entails. It isn't just a casual loop around the airport. It is a highly choreographed, strictly timed procedure that demands absolute precision, especially in terrible weather. Let's walk through it. First, the plane drops to 700 feet. Then, they brake left at exactly a 45-degree angle for 20 seconds. Next, they turn right to fly parallel to the runway downwind. Finally, they turn right again to line up with the runway for landing. And the absolute golden rule here? The crew has to keep the runway in sight out their windows the entire time. If they lose sight of it in the clouds, by law, they have to instantly abandon the approach.
Now, you might be wondering, why all these exact timings and angles? Well, it comes down to this magic number, 1.7. During this whole looping maneuver, the aircraft had to stay within a strict 1.7 nautical mile radius of the airport. Why? Because just beyond that invisible boundary, hidden deep inside the heavy rain and clouds, were jagged mountain peaks rising over 2,000 feet into the sky. If they strayed beyond 1.7 miles, that 700-foot altitude wasn't going to protect them anymore.
But here's the thing. Precision requires strict speed control, and the crew was flying way too fast.
For this maneuver, the absolute maximum airspeed was 140 knots. Because they hadn't briefed properly, they were flying at 160 knots. But it gets worse. Remember that strong tailwind? It was pushing the plane forward even faster, bringing their actual ground speed to a blistering 180 knots. They were just eating up their safety margins in a matter of seconds.
Which brings us to Chapter 4, the chain of errors. This is the point where the lack of a briefing, the rushed execution, and the excessive speed all start to compound disastrously. The crew is basically flying a maneuver they aren't prepared for, much faster than they should be, in weather where they can barely see. The errors literally start right at the beginning. When First Officer Geyer makes that initial 45-degree break left, he turns way too shallowly. So when he levels out to fly parallel to the runway, the aircraft gets squeezed right up against the airport, just 1.1 miles away instead of the 1.7 miles they needed. This completely wrecks the geometry of the approach, meaning their final turn back toward the runway is going to be impossibly tight.
Meanwhile, there's a massive breakdown in communication happening in the background. Second Officer Ho Xiang-ning is instructed multiple times by approach control to contact the landing tower, but he repeatedly fails to do it. Investigators later pointed out that his lack of English proficiency was a huge factor here. In a super high-stress moment, he just couldn't effectively communicate with ATC, leaving the tower completely confused about where the plane actually was.
Now take a look at this timeline for the final fatal turn. It's like a ticking clock. They're flying parallel to the runway. At 13 seconds, Captain Winlu smartly realizes the tailwind is pushing them too fast, meaning the standard 20-second wait is going to be too long. He sees the first officer struggling and takes manual control. But then, inexplicably, he delays the turn. At 22 seconds, the first officer urges him to turn right. But the captain is distracted. It takes a full 40 seconds before the captain finally disconnects the autopilot and starts the turn. Pushed by that crazy tailwind and the long delay, the 767 flies over 2.5 miles past the airport. They are now far outside the 1.7-mile safety boundary, heading straight for the mountains.
As they finally make the turn, they fly directly into a thick cloud. The first officer, whose main job right now is to keep the runway in sight, loses it completely. He delays telling the captain for several crucial seconds. Finally, he calls out the mandatory procedure. We must go around. According to their training, the second you lose visibility, you abort. But overwhelmed by the insane workload, Captain Winlu ignores him and just keeps turning blindly.
So at this exact moment, this massive Boeing 767 is careening directly toward the 755-foot Mount Day, literally seconds away from impact. Which brings up a really critical question. Modern planes have a ground proximity warning system, a GPWS, specifically designed to scream "pull up" when you get too close to the ground. So why on earth didn't it sound an alarm?
Tragically, it was a totally silent alarm. The older GPWS system on this plane relied on altimeters that only looked straight down. Because the crew had already lowered the landing gear and extended the flaps, the system just assumed they were making a perfectly safe, normal landing on a flat runway, so it muted itself. A newer system, the enhanced GPWS, would have cross-referenced their GPS with a terrain map, recognized the mountain, and warned them. But Air China hadn't installed it on this specific aircraft yet. Because of this absolute silence, the pilots only saw the mountain emerge from the clouds 5 seconds before impact. The captain pulled back hard, pitching the nose up, but the sheer momentum of the heavy aircraft just carried it forward.
Chapter 5. Tragedy and Lasting Reforms.
Flight 129 slammed into the side of Mount Day just 50 feet shy of the summit. The impact completely disintegrated the aircraft. Out of the 166 people on board, 129 lost their lives. Miraculously, 37 people survived, including Captain Winlu. This remained the deadliest air disaster on South Korean soil until 2024. So the crucial point here is how the aviation industry responds to failure. After the investigation, Air China didn't just tweak a couple of rules. They totally overhauled their safety culture. They brought in rigorous real-world simulator training for circling approaches and got incredibly strict about speed limits. They mandated full briefings for any sudden ATC changes. They revamped their crew resource management so first officers actually feel empowered to challenge a captain. They immediately put the newer enhanced ground proximity warning system in their entire fleet and officially designated Gimhae as a special airport. Because of all this, it remains the only fatal crash of an Air China plane up to the present day. The legacy of Flight 129 isn't just this grim story of compounding errors. It's actually a pretty incredible testament to how complex systems learn to heal themselves. By studying this disastrous mix of inexperienced crews, rush procedures, and technical blind spots, the lessons learned on that foggy mountain became the absolute bedrock of modern global aviation safety standards. It leaves us with a pretty provocative thought.
If every tragic failure permanently upgrades the safety of the entire global network, are we ever truly flying the same skies today as we did yesterday? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you in the next one.